so much, Connie, for that introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here in person at CAMWS. So right, over the past few months, many of you have no doubt seen outputs from, or had the chance to experiment directly with, generative language models such as ChatGPT. And as intriguing as such models can be to play with, perhaps the central challenge to their safe deployment, and the reason that tremendous human resources have to be invested in fine-tuning them with reinforcement learning approaches, is that they have a very strong tendency to replicate and even amplify biases present in the training corpora. So in other words, you get out what you put in, and therefore one consequence of that is that examining the outputs of a language model can often tell you a great deal about the attitudes, whether latent or explicit, reflected in the texts on which the model was trained. And this tendency for amplification constitutes a profound challenge for the natural language research community, but it also opens up avenues for new kinds of social scientific research, in which textual signatures of bias are used to document large-scale trends of concern and to identify potential avenues for restorative justice. So illustrating this kind of approach in the context of classics and race will be the central methodological theme of our paper today. But first, let's turn to a straightforward example involving, yes, ChatGPT. So as you can see on the slide, when prompted to write a short essay describing the ways in which classical material has been appropriated to support white supremacist ideologies, it has no trouble doing so. This illustrates first a basic point, one that is unfortunately all too obvious to this audience, that there is ample such material available online for training a detailed response on the subject. More revealing, however, is the nature of the specific evidence furnished, including immediate references to Aristotelian philosophy. As it happens, this attention to Aristotle neatly mirrors one of our findings, obtained from direct analysis of a highly curated corpus, which we will return to shortly. For now, it is sufficient to say that such patterns of attention are rarely random, and we hope to show how consideration of trends across large corpora can complement other forms of anti-racist scholarship and pedagogy within classics. So, inspired by recent work in the computational social sciences, this paper explores the operation of racial and disciplinary discourse in 3 online collections of texts. First, the racist appropriations of classical material archived by the Pharos Project, a long-term digital humanities initiative directed by Curtis Dozier at Vassar College. Secondly, discussion threads on Famai Volant, a now defunct informal forum devoted to the classics academic job market. And then finally, book reviews published by the Bryn Mawr Classical Review. In each discussion to follow, we will explain the motivation for analyzing that particular corpus, as well as key quantitative observations observed using a diverse range of text mining and natural language processing methods. More specifically, for the Pharos corpus, we will quantify the attention given to various historical figures in white supremacist writings. For Famai Volant and for BMCR, we will examine at scale how the field of classics has engaged with questions of race, racism, and interdisciplinary scholarship, as reflected in 2 extremely different contexts.
Using Pharos' existing digital archive, we assembled a corpus of 99 white supremacist documents to get a sense of which historical figures writers, emperors, etc. are occurring in these documents, we compiled a near-exhaustive list of names of major classical figures and searched it against the corpus. Out of a large selection of classical names mentioned in total, only 5 are referred to in more than 10% of documents. Not only do extremist writers keep returning to a small stable of ancient figures, their selection is also far from a cross-section of classical material. Of the top 5 figures, Plato is first, referred to in 23% of documents, Aristotle second, referred to in 20% of documents, and Socrates fifth, referred to in 11% of documents. Hence our lack of surprise when ChatGPT made immediate reference to Greek philosophy in response to the prompt about white supremacist use of the classics. In providing a clear picture of the pattern of exploitation of classical material, the data suggests how classicists might better understand the risks that attend the teaching of the corpus. While almost all texts are potentially open to exploitation, there are demonstrable differences in which texts tend to be appropriated most often. Our second corpus is the somewhat notorious job market blog Fame, active between 2005 and 2017, closing in 2018, and compromising nearly 20,000 anonymous posts. The motivation for studying this corpus sprang from a study of a similar economics job market blog by Alice Wu in 2018. Wu's analysis revealed a persistent misogynistic bias in anonymous comments about job candidates and the field of economics in general. The differing nature of the two fora makes strict comparison challenging, but we were further motivated by a lengthy qualitative assessment of the Fame by Joel Christensen, who noted the implication of some of the more critical comments with contemporary political discourse on race and gender. Simple keyword searches for terms such as racism show an appreciable uptick in the final years of the blog, often inflected by references to US politics. This is perhaps to be expected in the wake of the 2016 election.
So in her analysis of the economics job market blog, Wu had used a more computationally sophisticated approach than keyword searches. Specifically, she trained a language model on the corpus and then performed some prediction tasks to show that posts about women were more likely to feature comments about physical appearance or personal information, whereas posts about men tended to focus on academic or professional characteristics. Whatever bad qualities Fame had, as ably dissected by Christensen, its structures and norms did not lead to the same degree of persistent prejudice demonstrated on the economics forum. Therefore, we adapted Wu's approach to the somewhat different task of identifying contextual associations for key terms. So in other words, given a term of interest, such as racist, which other words appear most consistently in its context? That language models work brilliantly, or perhaps I should say alarmingly well, is a given in the age of ChatGPT. But even much older and simpler methods can be highly effective at identifying contextual associations. So here, for instance, are tables showing semantic associations derived from a word-to-vec model of vocabulary co-occurrence patterns for two relatively neutral terms, Latin and SCS. And in both cases, we have reassuringly sensible top results. Greek on the one hand, APA on the other. Now, when examining a term such as racist, however, we perhaps unsurprisingly encounter a host of evaluative and pejorative vocabulary. Now, reading the comments that contain this vocabulary corroborates Christensen's observations that posts adopting widely different sociopolitical positions nevertheless share a common tendency reflected in diverse internet fora towards the use of pejorative language. Now, to perhaps go without saying that seeking to address racism, perceived or real, on an anonymous forum, however well-intentioned or well-argued, is unlikely to be a productive enterprise. But the data do provide a reminder that the dynamics of social media will often trump the intentions of participants. Okay, so switching gears, the Bryn Mawr Classical Review, of course, requires no introduction for this audience. But following the examples of corpora whose discourse ranges from informality on the one hand to outright racism on the other, the motivation for including BMCR in this study may be opaque. Specifically, what can we learn about the relationship between classics and race or racism from a highly professional institution in which many of us participate as readers and writers, and the content of which largely focuses on academic monographs about the ancient world? The answer follows in part from the scale of the corpus. So representing almost 30 years of reviews of subjects ranging across the various subfields of classics, BMCR provides a ready-made model of the changing discipline, and equally importantly, a model that, because of its electronic publication, is more straightforwardly tractable for computational analysis. Unlike Pharos, which features appropriations of classical texts and classical studies, and unlike Famai Volant, which features the anonymous opinions of a subset of individuals involved in the profession, the BMCR corpus, by contrast, allows us to make inquiry about how mainstream scholarly discourse treats certain topics related to our theme. In this exploratory work, we proceeded by selecting key terms of interest relating to race or disciplinary terminology in order to generate frequency data over time, and thereby to establish whether there are any meaningful changes across the past 30 years, as well as what those changes might imply about the field. Okay, the shift to considering terms related to race together with terms related to disciplinary terminology is doubly motivated. The first motivation is simply the plausibility that disciplinary terminology will be found in significant numbers in the BMCR corpus in a way that might shed some light on the use of the terms. The second motivation is rather more substantive. Recent discourse has focused on the implications of the language we use to describe our study, classics, Greek and Roman studies, etc., with the audiences we seek to address, where those audiences are often conceived either as people already in the know, or people unfamiliar with, or even put off by exclusive or evaluative language. This question of the relationship between inclusivity and nomenclature has led many classics departments to seriously consider the significance of the name, and in several high-profile cases have indeed changed names, as for instance with Berkeley's Department of Ancient Greek and Roman Studies. In a recent Inside Higher Education article, Max Goldman and Rebecca Futo-Kennedy note that, quote, even the name classics has been slowly disappearing over a decade or more from some campuses, replaced by more precise names like Greek and Roman studies, ancient Mediterranean studies, or Greek, Latin, and ancient Mediterranean studies.
In our work, we examined the frequency of several of these terms in the BMCR corpus to see just how much relative visibility they have. We also include the term Western civilization, which is often treated as a conservative counterpart to ancient Mediterranean studies and other departmental designations, as it is by Goldman and Kennedy. There are, of course, significant differences in the application of these kinds of terms. There are few departments of Western civilization, for example, though there are numerous courses and even programs and institutes. The reason for including this term is rather to give a sense of the degree of emphasis given to it by frequency alone. And we should also add that our aim here is not to argue for a particular nomenclature, but to shed light on what the use of disciplinary terminology is like in this large sample of professional discourse. The upshot, as seen in the chart here, is that references to alternative terminology for the discipline, such as Greek and Roman studies or Mediterranean studies, remains minimal. In fact, the difference is so large, over 1 order of magnitude for Greek and Roman studies, more for Mediterranean studies, that it's very unlikely to be due to book and series titles, including the more common terms classics and classical studies. References to Western civilization, which plausibly occur in a wider range of contexts than do formal terms used to describe the discipline, are nevertheless infrequent relative to classics and classical studies. While the relative proportions may not be surprising in themselves, it's important to consider the implications for characterization of the field. And renaming a department, if renaming a department undergirds anti-racist scholarship, or so the thinking might go, then the process of rebranding would need to work its way into the wider professional discourse in order to have the full effect intended. Imagine the absurdity of a situation in which all the departments were called Ancient Mediterranean Studies, but the professional discourse continued to be dominated by reference to classics. In practice, that's extremely unlikely to happen, but what the current data shows is that up to 2022, at least, there has been no significant uptake in the use of the alternative disciplinary terminology, even though the situation could start to look different within the next few years. Next, we examine a small set of terms directly denoting race and racism in order to establish whether there have been any significant changes over the course of the 30 years of the BMCR corpus. Perhaps, as expected, use of the stronger language, racism and racist, is rare, though there does appear to be a small increase in the period 2020 to 2022, plausibly in response to discursive shifts at the societal level. The more neutral terms, race and racial and ethnicity and ethnic, while fluctuating from decade to decade, are nevertheless uniformly and significantly more frequent. The late uptick in race/racial seems to align with the slight increase in occurrence of racism and racist over the same period, but this change does not seem to have affected ethnicity and ethnic. This may suggest an interest in current racial discourses that does not overlap closely with interest in ancient ethnicity. If there is such an interest in current racial discourses, it does not derive from contact with various contemporary area studies fields, at least as measured by explicit mention of such fields, including American or African American studies. To get a sense of just how relatively uncommon the racial and area studies terms are in BMCR and how little such terms vary over short time periods, compare, for a moment, not just ethnicity, as we did on an earlier slide, but rather an important semantically variable word like identity, which appears in over 20% of reviews from the year 2000 onwards. To contextualize all these relatively stable terms, which in several cases are also low frequency, it's salutary to consider an unambiguously big terminological change in order to see what can happen to a field in a short time. Here we see a rapid and consistent increase in frequency of mentions of reception studies from effectively 0 in the early 90s to more than 3% of all reviews in the 2020s. Unambiguous detection of this expected temporal trend is encouraging technical validation for our text-based approach. Salient disciplinary trends are indeed legible in this corpus, even when only performing a keyword search. More substantively, it has been observed by Patrice Rankine and others that reception studies has been an effective vehicle for anti-racist scholarship, a position we endorse. The data suggests, however, that while the potential for new terminology and an enthusiastic embrace of that terminology exists, as demonstrated by reception studies, there has yet to be anything approaching a similar commitment to discourse on race. Finally, we repeated the word embeddings approach from the Famavolent study to evaluate semantic associations in the BMCR corpus with a selection of the terms related to race and ethnicity. The results show intuitive associations between, for example, singular and plural forms of the same word, such as identity and identities, which, while uninteresting in itself, suggests that the model operates well. Contexts in which you find the singular form identity are basically very similar to the contexts in which you find the plural form identities. Less proximate, but more informative, are the associations between ethnicity and racial, or ethnic and indigenous, or identity and agency. Among all these words, contexts for the term racial are perhaps unsurprisingly more frequently populated by terms related to the study of race and racism. By this, we do not mean cognate words, though those do appear too, but other highly associated terms such as nationalist, colonialist, or hegemonic. We know, therefore, that the word racial occurs with sufficient frequency in intuitive contexts such as that the model learns those contexts well. The word race, by contrast, poses a potential problem for our model. Static models, such as the one we're using for this work and which are outdated in computational terms, do not distinguish between different words that have the same morphology. As a result, there is a single set of quantitative associations with the word race, no matter whether it refers to a foot race or the social construct. Still, given this difference in historical importance between the two meanings of race, you might expect associations in the BMCR corpus to skew in favor of the social construct. It might be somewhat surprising then that the actual associations contain so little that is germane to our study. In short, discussions of race, the social construct, does not outweigh the discussion of horse races or nearby references to warriors or monsters. This result provides some limited, indirect evidence, therefore, that concepts prominent in public discourse need not be reflected in our scholarly discourse to the same degree. That matter of degree and the potential significance of how much attention we pay to diverse topics can be evaluated more effectively using the methods we've outlined here and which we hope to develop as we continue this work.
So to conclude, our preliminary textual analysis of these three very different corpora has suggested some paths forward for thinking about classics and race. First, in the most extreme case of white supremacist material documented on Pharos, we find that while many classical figures can be deployed or appropriated by racists, the subculture tends to focus on certain elements as symbolic of Western civilization. This focus isn't merely skewed towards Greek, it is also specifically philosophical more than anything else. Why that is, a performance of rationalism, for instance, is perhaps a matter to which we as a field should be more attentive, given that it is clearly not the case that all classical material is in practice equally susceptible to exploitation. Although to some extent an historical artifact at this point, the Famivolent corpus showed a recent uptick in discussions of racism, which tended to use a range of critical or pejorative vocabulary. Whatever the merits of the individual arguments may have been, as a whole, the tenor of these discussions does not suggest a principal focus on accomplishing an anti-racist agenda. Finally, among the various results of our analyses of the BMCR corpus, perhaps the most salient is the still somewhat limited impact of scholarship on race on the field as a whole, a point that is clarified by quantitative profiling of terms related to various approaches and disciplines, especially reception studies. Our current moment, however, is marked by especially rapid change in discourse as well as in technology, and it is plausible that 5 or even 2 years from now, our results might look very different. Thank you.
Only in high school. I see some recruiters out here, okay? Isn't she amazing? My God. I couldn't think like that or even talk like that when I was your age, Jesus. Okay, if I may, if we could hold questions, I think, to the end, get the papers, and then have a question, a Q&A for all of our speakers at the end, that would, just to facilitate and make sure we have plenty of time for a Q&A. All right? Thank you so much, okay?
Thank you, Connie.
All right. While they're sitting up, and hopefully we can set up